die, Father. There's nothing left. Ever since I was a child, I had the feeling that something is missing in me. I want to know why I'm here. Can any of us know that? Become yourself. Then God and the devil don't matter. I want to learn. I want to understand. Be careful. Can you find the force to enable these two quite opposite lives to live together in yourself? At any moment, the wolf can devour the lamb. And you must learn what it means to become responsible. This is an exact science. And that is why you are here.
From the foreknown history to the unknown future, this is Red Ice Radio. For the Seeker.
One must strive to know.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. We are delighted to have you with us today. My name is Henrik, and this is Red Ice Radio. We are going to continue our quest in search for answers to some of the most intriguing questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? And who is really in charge? Josh Reeves is a Dallas, Texas-based researcher, filmmaker, and radio talk show host. He has made several documentaries and mini-documentaries, his latest being The Lost Secrets of Ancient America. We will begin to discuss the ancient wall in Rockwall, Texas, which the town is named after, and who the ancient and mysterious peoples who inhabited the Americas long before the rise of colonial America or natives might have been. We'll talk about mysterious mounds in various states, similar myths, giant skeletons, and the stories surrounding them. Welcome back, Josh. It's great to have you on the program once again. I hope you're well and that everything is good down in Texas with you.
Oh, it's great. I'm glad to be back here with you, Henrik, and it's always fun when we do shows together, and I'm excited to talk about what we're going to be talking about today here with my new film and all the subject matter that this entails. So, yeah, ready to get into it with you. Great.
Yeah, great job on the new film. It's a topic that is one, I think it's one of the most exciting for me at the moment, mankind's, true history and the eerie strangeness of the ancient world and the possibility of giants, snake people. I mean, it's all over the place when you begin to really get into it and you understand how much of our history has been covered up. It's just amazing, and you do a great job in covering some of this, of course, in terms of the Smithsonian and some of the other academia. We'll get into that a little bit later, but tell us, Josh, how you got onto this track. As people who listen to the show and your show obviously know that you've done the films The Secret Ride and all that, and this is it's a leap in another direction, if you will. So how did you get into this?
Well, actually, this is something that I've wanted to do for a great many years. I found out about the subject initially and started working on this project long before I ever had a radio show or long before I'd ever even done a film or anything else. I mean, at this stage, when I first found out about the information pertaining to this film, The Lost Secrets of Ancient America, I at that point was just an activist. I was somebody who was, still trying to learn as much as I could. I wasn't somebody yet. I wanted to be active and I wanted to do something. But at that point, I really didn't know how to do it. So I was really just doing activist stuff, being out in the streets, passing out DVDs, doing 9/11 Truth stuff. And in 2004, I was reading this book by Jim Marrs called The Rule by Secrecy. And if you haven't read that book, or people out there haven't read that book, it's a great primer. Yeah, it's a great one to give to people who are kind of new to this information or any of this information, because it covers so much, such a wide scope, everything from the banking system to ancient Sumerian stuff. It goes all over the place. And so it's a great primer for people who may be new to this information. So I was reading that, and at the end of one of the chapters there, Jim Marrs says, maybe one day we'll have answers to all these questions of these various mysteries. And he named off a few, and then he said the ancient mysterious wall in Rockwall, Texas. And it was, my hair just stood up on my arms. And the reason that is because my entire life growing up around the suburbs and areas outside of Dallas, Texas here, I've had a couple of strange occurrences happen around the area where the rock wall is back when I was a teenager and back in the 90s and stuff, long before I ever knew about any of this stuff. And friends of mine had similar experiences. And to give you an example of some of those experiences, specifically two that happened to me, one was an incident back in the early 90s with me and my one of my best friends who worked with me on the film as well. We were going to work in Dallas, and we were going across a bridge across Lake Ray Hubbard where part of the wall is now buried underneath it. And we left to go to work at like noon, and when we got across the second bridge, it seemed like we had been gone maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and we stopped to get gas, and we got out, and we looked at the clock, and it was like 5 o'clock. And we were like, how's it 5 o'clock? How are we late? We left, and it only seemed like 15 or 20 minutes had gone, and really what had happened is we experienced some sort of missing time of it. And then another incident, we were out near the Rockwall area, and we were near an old power plant, and we were just, in our early 20s, and we were out there late at night just looking for a place to hang out. And we went by this area that's near the lake near Rockwall, and we got hit. I can't describe this any other way. We got hit by some sort of spiritual force that knocked us out and made us both black out. And then we were basically, two grown men crying our eyes out in tears, traumatized because some sort of energy, to this day we don't know what it was, it hit us and really knocked us on our rear ends, and we didn't know what it was. And for years, we had friends that had stories of seeing UFO sightings a lot around this area. So again, when I was reading the Jim Marr stuff, it clicked like a light bulb. I said, I have to uncover this. I have to find out what this is about. And so fast forward a few years, 2007, I made my first film. I started doing my radio show then. And immediately when I first started, like the second or third show I ever did is when I found out about the Council for National Policy stuff. And so I was really on that area of things up until probably right after the last time we spoke, Henrik, last time I was on the show last year. And so I have been off and on, even though I've been working on this project for years. It's almost a 10-year thing, but it's just now culminating in this first film, which is really not all there is to say. And this is an open investigation. This is really just the introduction to this. But I'm excited to tell people that, as far as what you can know about the rock wall up to this point, everything there is to know that we know and we have data for right now is in this film. So that was really the main genesis for this for me, Hendrik, in the beginning, was this thing where I felt like, there was some reason that I was supposed to find out about this. And so I've kind of made it my personal mission to uncover this thing.
Let's talk about Rockwall. Let's begin there. This is where you begin the film. For those who don't know, tell us where and, of course, what it is, Josh.
Well, what the Rockwall is it's actually it's a structure that is buried underneath the town of Rockwall, Texas. It was discovered in the 1800s when a lot of the locals were first coming into the area and setting up their farms. You had two gentlemen initially who first moved into the area that were Freemasons, and I always thought this was very strange that they had come from, one came from Virginia, one came from Tennessee, and they just landed in this spot where it eventually became Rockwall. And so they didn't really have any farming communities or anything like that set up. They had, just some little habitations and things. And about a year later, you started to have people coming in from different areas setting up farming communities. And so you had 3 or 4 men, this is all detailed in the film, you had 3 or 4 men who started setting up farms, they started setting up water wells, and they were all sort of starting the town at the same time, so they were arguing over what they wanted to call it. One wanted to call it after his last name, of course. Other guy wanted to name it after himself. And so eventually when they started digging these water wells, every one of them, every time they would try to dig down to get some groundwater, they would hit this stone structure. And so one of the gentlemen came over to the other farmer, to the Wade farm, and said, the darndest thing, I'm trying to get water back here, and every time I do, I get down to the bottom and I hit this stone. We can't seem to get water. And all the guys had that problem, so they excavated part of this thing and dug it out and were confused as to what it was and why it was there. And so they called the local masons, Mr. Heath and Mr. Barnes, and those were the guys who settled the town. They came in, they took one look at this thing immediately and saw that through the stonework and the way that it was put together with this mortar that looked as if it was smoothed perfectly with a trowel, they immediately recognized this as being the work of a stonemason. So this is when they declared to the people who had set up the farming communities, look, you guys are going to have to all eat crow on this one. None of you can name it after yourselves because this is absolute proof right here that somebody was here long before us. And that is where the idea that this structure was actually built by someone way back in antiquity really first took root and really first became this idea of this being something that wasn't a natural formation.
There's been some wild stories, obviously, what this is, where it comes from, some of the consequent excavations. I think there's records going back to the 1800s on this, and we can run through some of them if you want to, Josh. I mean, you have a great portion of this about what Sam Slick tells about in some of his, I think there's some of his letters. Tell us about who this character is and what he said about all of this.
Well, specifically what we discuss in the film are some reports from, and this is really where I started. I started looking at, okay, let's go look at the news reports, what was being said about the rock wall and all this stuff when it was first discovered. And there are several news reports from a local Rockwall newspaper that is no longer in existence that was called the Rockwall Success. And they printed 3 different stories with a gentleman who used the pseudonym of Sam Slick that described the first story, and this is all detailed in the film. The first story that they ran was about a giant skull that was found out near Rockwall in a town that's now called Heath, which subsequently I just found out recently by reading a story in the newspaper locally here. That area where they initially found the giant skeletons and where they found some of these subterranean caverns and whatnot that is described by Sam Slick in these newspaper articles, that whole area now, which I didn't even know, has been completely taken over by the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons.
Really?
And I just thought that was fascinating when you take a look at this information and the implications of it. And so they printed this story about the giant skeleton. They told people could come down and check it out. People did. And then apparently there was 2 other stories ran where they talked about finding this abode, what they called an abode of a giant that was out near there. And they made the declaration in this paper that this was no question, this was no doubt, this was the guy who built the rock wall. Now, I don't believe that, and I don't believe that to be true now, but I definitely think there is certainly a connection to this, and one has to do with the other. But the interesting thing about the Sam Slick thing is this has been a big point of contention for people who have researched the Rockwall stuff, because people said, well, this is all got to be BS because this guy, Sam Slick, was just a satirical writer from Canada. He wrote all these stories of nonsense and big tall tales and blah, blah, blah. And that's what people like to do back then. They just like to tell tales. And that's not the impression that you get when you talk to the old timers, when you talk to people who were, 80, 90 years old and they say, no, people didn't do that back then. People were, a lot more stand up and didn't want, they didn't like people telling lies.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why this guy used this name Sam Slick, because come to find out, after I started investigating this guy, this guy died years and years and years before these Sam Slick articles pertaining to the Rockwall and the Giants were printed. So obviously this was somebody else who was trying to use this name to keep themselves from being, basically seen as seen as, well, they, that's the thing is that when you printed stuff like that back then, people, initially, if you didn't have proof, people would lynch you. People were really, really, really adamant about the truth and wanted the truth to be in papers, and it was a powerful force of media back then. And so I think that's why this guy basically used this fake name. But come to find out, subsequently, after the third story was printed, the Rockwall Success newspaper was bought out, and no more stories pertaining to any of this stuff was ever printed in Rockwall ever again. So it's a fascinating part of this where, you know, it really made me suspicious of the people who had tried to completely assign this thing of giants as being BS because of this Sam Slick thing, and that really being their only proof. So that was one of the places I started, Henrik, as far as my research, because essentially what it was is I started out in the investigation. I try to give people a sort of the methodology of how I approach this in the film. I try to kind of sequence the film in that way. And so the way that I approached the research initially was, okay, here's this rock wall. I want to find out anything I can find out about it. And I started meeting with people who had researched it previously. One gentleman in particular I met in 2008, John Lindsay, who's done the most extensive stuff on the wall in the past 50 years or whatever. He's done it. He's done an archaeological dig. He's been there. He's got a lot of analysis on this. So I went to his house and met with him and got all of his information as far as the makeup of the rock wall, which we can talk about as well if you like. And so the initial thing was, okay, this is the information that says, obviously, this is not a natural formation. Obviously, this was built by somebody. So as soon as we established that, then my next step was, okay, well, who could it have been? And so once we had the thing established with giants, these reports of giants, I started saying, okay, well, what else have we had in the United States that might match these reports? And to my surprise, I mean, there are literally thousands of them.
Yeah.
I mean, I detail a great many of them in the film, but I still don't even scratch the surface as far as how many of these reports there have been. And so one of the things that I kept finding over and over again with these giant skeletons was their appearance around what they call mounds. And so I wanted to find out if there were obviously mounds found in Rockwall. And the interesting thing about it is I found out that there are 13 known mounds in Rockwall County, and I can't find one of them. And I can't find anybody that knows anywhere location where they're at. Because a lot of people that do know about it, they don't tell people where it is. I've got a good idea where a couple of them are at. They now have houses and stuff built on them. But once I had established that there was elevation changes that are not normal to this area, that's when I started saying, okay, let's go and look and look all over the place and see where else this has happened. And of course, there is a lot of evidence that of mounds, giants, and everything else, not just in Rockwall and not just in America, but really all over the world.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there's incredible many connections here between these complexes. From a European perspective, as soon as I see some of this, it's like this is exactly what you have in England and other parts of Europe as well. We know that they're worldwide, of course, in Asia and I don't know how much is in Africa, actually, in terms of these mounds, though. But nonetheless, there has been excavations, as you say, into the mounds. There have been skeletons dug up, and these are giant skeletons. These are skulls that can fit over a regular human's head. I mean, it's incredible, and yet at the same time, today we have you cover the old news stories, the old reporting from 1800s and forward. That shows the genuine reality of giants, but slowly this has become covered up. It's become something of a joke. There's been tons of fake images released, specifically in the online world now, which kind of also automatically discredits all these ancient stories. But I think you're doing the right thing by going actually back to the old stories and getting the real score from there. And it's amazing. It's all over America.
Well, it is, and that's the interesting thing that I find as well that I don't know if I really was able to iterate in this first volume of the film, but certainly will in later volumes. But the interesting thing to me is I find that when you go, the farther that you go back in these reports, and really some of the ones that I cover in the film are really just the past few hundred years. But when you start to go farther and farther back into these reports, like there's some in France from like the 1400s where they were finding, they found a 32-foot skeleton. The farther that you seem to go back in history, the larger that these skeletons seem to be. I find that just highly interesting. But you're exactly right. I mean, there is so much misinformation, disinformation, blatant lies, Photoshop pictures. I mean, there's just so much of this, and it's really cognitive dissonance, as you mentioned, to get people thinking that it's all BS, when in reality you've got, as with any of this stuff, you've got BS mixed with truth, and so you have to sort of go in and sift through what is what. But what I found was, again, as I mentioned earlier, just the most interesting was that in almost every single case of these giant skeletons being found, in an overwhelming amount of the cases, you have them being found inside of these mounds. And that was the interesting thing about the mounds to me, is that most people assume that when they see one of these ancient mounds, or they go to one of these, state parks or something in the United States where these are located, I think oftentimes the misconception that's put out is that these mounds are strictly burial mounds, and that's not the case in every case. Certainly, some of them do contain burials, but these mounds also serve a multiple purpose. In some cases, they are burial mounds. In some cases, they are ceremonial mounds. In some cases, they're both. And that's what I think is highly interesting about it. And one of the things I detail in the film is the really what the ceremonial usages of these mounds were, and how strange it seems that the traditions about the afterlife and how it pertains to these mounds and these rituals is mirrored exactly to traditions that come from Egypt and the Middle East and all the rest of this. The alignments line up the same. And so that's when you start to realize that, if there's nothing to this giant thing, then why is it that the people who inhabited the areas around where these giant skeletons and these mounds are found all seem to have this information and knowledge that we can trace directly back to ancient Mesopotamia?
Yeah, indeed. It's really, really interesting. And I think, let's talk actually a little bit about how big the complex is, what the rock wall is made up of, because it's kind of, in the past, when these archaeological excavations have been made, there seems to be some kind of confusion. Is it actually covering up something? Is it kind of from a center being tentacled outwards? Seems to be other parts of it too that has to do with these rumors about this subterranean temple, if you will, that are found. I want to get your take on the reality of that, the possibility of that. They found some black marble pillars in there, an iron chest, and these giant axes and pots and stuff like that. What do you think about that story?
Well, it's a good question, Henrik. I mean, honestly, for my inclusion of that stuff in the data is really just for the inclusion of trying to get, completion and trying to get all of the important data in there. But I think that, it's one of those things where without the proof of it, without even seeing it yourself, it's hard to 100% take it as the truth. But,
sure. Yep.
But when you weigh it against the other data, when you weigh it against the other finds that have been found outside of Rockwall, as I mentioned earlier, when you weigh it against other things that have been found, and when you weigh it against these finds from the Middle East where they found, that they have the 25-foot iron bed of Og, the giant, in a museum,
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
That's, to me, that's the thing where you have to stay rational in looking at the facts, but you also can't just allow yourself to be carried away by what the mainstream consensus is trying to tell you is the truth on these things. And that's why I encourage people, when they watch the film, to sort of, have an open mind about all of these things, and don't so much try to read in everything that you think about the facts into the information, because oftentimes you find things that completely blow that away. But as far as the structure of the rock wall and all these other things connected to it, the one thing that I find time and time again is that you have the rock wall, but then you also have what seem to be other structures around it. You also seem to have things very near to the wall, and almost as if the wall was built onto it. You have some of these things that do appear to be natural formations, and you have all this existing simultaneously within each other, in the rock wall. And so what's happened through the years, whenever there's been any sort of archaeological excavations done, they've all been done at different locations. None of them have been conducted at the same spot. And so what's happened is that one archaeological site will be conducted here, and it will have that specific phenomenon that, for all intents and purposes, when you look at it a certain way, does look like it's a natural formation. It does look like it's rock that is formed there. But when you go to another spot, you see these large flat stones that Count Byron de Prorock, the famous archaeologist, saw when he came to Rockwall in 1925, that he stated were identical to the same stones that he had seen in Carthage in North Africa and these ancient Phoenician Berber colonies in North Africa. And he was just blown away by this. And, of course, he was outside of the mainstream of archaeological finds and science and everything at his time. But when you had other archaeological sites conducted in other locations, you would have people that say, well, this is obviously natural. And that's what I found through my research is that, yes, you do have all of this coexisting together, and that at different layers of this wall, I mean, you've got a 20-mile diameter structure that's buried 7 stories underground. And when you look at the layers of it, you see where, wow, this stuff down here at the bottom is really old. You can tell by the weathering on the stones. But wait a minute, this stuff up here that's only 7 or 9 feet under the ground, which is obviously still covered by, eons and centuries of debris and overburden and everything. It's covered up. But when you dig down about 7 to 9 feet, you start to find these larger stones that look just like the stuff that you saw in 7,000-year-old Canaanite things in the ancient Middle East and North Africa. So that's when I started to realize that what we're dealing with here is 2 different types of phenomenon that has been convoluted together. So, in other words, the scientific community comes out, they already have a vested stake in not wanting this to be man-made or made by someone. So they come out, they take one look at a certain site that fits their purview, and they say, okay, that's natural, and that's it. And that standpoint of that, which was established by the Smithsonian Institute in 1927, is what stands to this day. And it's unbelievable to me, and should be unbelievable to everybody out there, that after almost 100 years, no one has challenged this scientific standpoint on the rock wall, even though there is voluminous amounts of evidence to prove that you have multiple different types of phenomena. Until you have analysis and concrete, documented archaeological data that is collated on multiple different sites, people are never going to know the real truth about it because, again, there was enough anomalous things around it to bring up questions. Rock in general is not found in this area of North Texas. There is no stone, there is no natural rock anywhere found. And yet there is a disconnect where people believe that there is. But when you go and research the geology of the area and you go and research the findings, rock is an anomaly in this area, and especially when you look at what the rock wall is made up of. And I'd like to go through that if I could, Henrik.
Definitely, it sounds a little bit like the Bosnian pyramids as well, with, there are different geologists that have visited the sites and they have various results and all that. And I want to try to get into a little bit more on that. What do you make of the wall, Josh? Tell us if you think it protects something. Is it trying to keep something out? Is it connected to another kind of complex with these underground, temples or something else? What do you make of it?
Well, it's strange because it seems that that this thing provided a variety of usages. And I think, as I mentioned just a minute ago, with the various types of material that are used in the wall, where you have, very old stones at the bottom, and then towards the top you have different building materials that are used. Basically, whatever was, the known building materials at the time you see used. So I think that you had one usage for this wall, which was way, way, way back in antiquity, which was a seawall, because you used to have the Gulf of Mexico come all the way up to where the wall is, and they know this because of the blue shale deposits that covered the wall in some sort of catastrophic event 12,000 years ago. When you get down to the bottom of the wall, you start finding shark's teeth embedded into the wall, sand dollars with fresh meat inside of them. And so it appears that at one point, the wall served one purpose. And then much later, thousands of years later, when you started to have indigenous populations and also new settlers and different things, people coming across the area, this is when you started to see the construction of some of these subterranean chambers and whatnot that run inside of the wall, because the subterranean chamber that you're describing here, Henrik, that you've mentioned here a couple of times, this specific underground chamber system was discovered near a portion of the rock wall, the portion that was originally first discovered on the Wade family farm, which is located now in Rockwall right next to a Walmart, which I show in the film, where they have, they basically throwing it in your face going, ha, 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 because they have built this Walmart, with parts of the outside of it that look like the wall, but that if you go and ask anybody in Rockwall about the wall, they don't know what you're talking about. And so,
jeez, isn't that amazing?
It is.
So close, and yet people have no clue. I experienced this myself too in various sites wherever you ask about. So yeah, it's the same around the world.
And that's the thing, and I think that's why there's been so much confusion. People think that they can just go to Rockwall and see the wall. They don't realize that it's buried. And as I said before, that goes back to this thing of there being two different types of phenomena we're dealing with. But going back to the underground structure, supposedly there was several of these underground chambers, that one which connected from the side of the old Wade farm into probably it's not very far up the road. It's only probably about a mile and a half or so up the road to where the old Rockwall Courthouse is. And that absolutely was built on top of of what they called a temple room or a temple chamber. And there was a subterranean passageway that led up to this thing. And some gentlemen tried to go up in there and in the 1930s and made it part of the way up there, and then got spooked and were scared the whole thing was going to collapse. So they backed out of there. But my point is, Henrik, is that you have the wall itself, you have this 20-mile diameter structure, but it also appears that you have chambers, rooms. There's been pictures of that from some of the digs that John Lindsay did, where you have what he called rooms, these vaulted rooms, where you have what look like windows made out of rock. And so it appears that you had multiple different periods of habitation of this structure, which gave this structure multiple usages over millennia of time. As I mentioned before, we had the seawall usage, and then later it was used, according to John Lindsay, some of the evidence that he found, it appeared to him that someone was using this thing to hide from someone. And his speculation was that, maybe they were using this to hide from these cannibalistic giants.
Was it always underground, though, do you think?
Well, that's the question. That's the real thing. It may not have always been underground. It may have been, but it may be so old that, it eventually just got covered up with overburden and dirt and everything washed over it for years and years and years.
Yep.
But here's the thing. There's also another tunnel system that leads from the old Rockwall Courthouse down about a mile or two down to the Trinity River. And supposedly it goes both ways. And apparently from what John Lindsay was saying, this seems to be some sort of tunnel system that someone created to be able to go from this Temple Dome area down to the river with water, to bring water back and forth without being seen. So I found that very interesting. It does make a lot of sense when you look at it. But again, there's really no way for us. We don't have a historical precedent here to compare this to. So all we can really do is go by what the facts are telling us. But there's no question that when you look at the makeup of the Rockwall stones, that it was built with a high level of sophistication, and was built with a high level of sophistication, way, way, way back in antiquity.
Yeah, I want to try to get to a little bit of what you think, of course, go into a little bit more of the giants. There are many different tentacles. You've visited other places, other states as well that ties into this, and we'll get there, but I want to stay a little bit more on the Rockwall here.
Okay.
You said they placed the Rockwall courthouse right on top of at least speculated where one of these complex sort of structures was, correct?
Right. It was some sort of rock, what they called a rock-lined temple room. And what's interesting about that site is you can go there now. They've actually built a new courthouse across town. And I kid you not, Henrik, this thing they built across town as their new courthouse.
A temple?
I mean, it looks like it. I'm kid you not. It looks like Solomon's temple. I mean, it's unbelievably Masonic. I mean, as soon as I saw them start building this thing, I was just like, what are they doing here? And it's this massive structure that almost looks like a state capitol building, and yet it's just a local courthouse for a small town. You're wondering, why does a small town need, Solomon's temple for its courthouse? But the interesting thing about this temple room where the old courthouse is located is that they built sometime back in, I guess, I guess it was about the 1950s or somewhere like that. Back when the scare, the Red Scare and the scare of nuclear annihilation throughout the world was going around. Everybody was building nuclear fallout shelters, and there's actually a subterranean nuclear fallout shelter that's built into this old Rockwall courthouse, and it's built underground into this rock-lined chamber. So the interesting thing about that is that, it seems that the people that built this courthouse, who integrated this already existing structure into the courthouse, knew something about the makeup of this stone material. It's virtually indestructible. I mean, it's made up of all these rare earth metals and minerals whose hardness is almost on the scale of a diamond. I mean, these things were built to last and built to withstand almost anything. And so it's very interesting that they utilize that for their fallout shelter, almost as if there was some knowledge that this stuff could, pretty much withstand anything.
Well, the question is, what do they know? Is it still used as a temple today? And this this new building, the courthouse, is basically like a commemorative of this, whatever the origins of this thing is. I mean, I can't remember if it's the same structure or whatnot, but you also had a section in the movie where you brought up, well, basically this the cult, if you will, the initiatory cults that we can see scattered throughout the world, but possibly that it's been used for this, these caves and caverns. And I mean, it is more or less speculated the Freemasonic Brotherhood and all that basically has just lent and borrowed something from these ancient cults, basically, so we could have a kind of a continuation, if you will, on this, and it might even take place right in Rockwall. What do you think?
Well, there certainly always has been a massive interest with Freemasonry and local Freemasonry around here, and the Rockwall itself. And every time that there comes to a piece of evidence or an artifact or something like that we're trying to look at, it always seems to go back to the Freemasons. And John Lindsay ran into this problem when he was doing his last dig. Everything was going fine. He had the city behind him. Everything was going great. And then this conversation came up about this 2.5-ton garnet stone with these hieroglyphics on it. And that was at one time in the basement of the old Rockwall courthouse. And there were several inmates back when they used to keep inmates up at the top of that place. I remember when I was a kid driving by there, and you could see the jailbirds like hanging out at the top of this, this little building and stuff. And come to find out, some of these inmates had seen a well-known Rockwall politician who's also a Freemason, and some other gentlemen taking out this giant stone at in the middle of the night in a big heist. And John Lindsay's been told that that the stone is still around and one day it'll resurface. And what's interesting is that as soon as he started asking who has it and found out who has it and started asking questions about it, they immediately shut everything down. His dig lost all his funding. Everything they completely pulled out. And he was saying, well, I just was curious about this stone. Why is this such a secret? And then you come to find out that these two initial guys, Heath and Barnes, who founded Rockwall, also founded the first Masonic Lodge in Rockwall, the East Fork Masonic Lodge. And it's interesting, if you can go to their website right now, the East Fork Masonic Lodge in Rockwall. It's interesting. They have a little animated GIF wall that goes around the perimeter of their website, almost as a hint to this. Whether or not they were using these sites in Rockwall specifically, whether or not they were using these sites in any kind of rituals or anything like that, I really don't have any data on that. I haven't heard anything on that. But I will tell you one thing that is interesting is that all of these ancient sites around the United States, the ancient mound sites, the earthworks, most, if not all of them, are all aligned to the winter solstices, the equinoxes, solar events. Many of them are aligned to particular star systems such as Deneb, Cygnus, Orion. And one of my goals for this film was to go out to one of these sites that I visited and get footage of either the equinox sunrise or the equinox sunset or solstice sunrise or solstice sunset, one of those, because I thought it would be great to show people in the film, not just tell them, and actually show on video the solar alignments that occur at these sites. And that's when I started to really become suspicious, Henrik, was because I started looking at all these sites, and then I went to other ones and looked at the times at which they were open, and even ones I didn't visit. What's interesting is all of these sites where these are located, they all open in the morning well after sunrise, and they all close in the day well before sunset. Mm-hmm. So it's impossible. And I found out that Stonehenge is the same way. You have the high level order of druids are allowed to go out there on the solstices and sunsets and do their rituals, and people have to stand way back. And so that's when I started thinking, I bet these guys are utilizing these sites at those specific times, and that's why you and I can't get in there, because it talks about, especially with Moundville in Alabama, which was one of the sites I visited, it talks specifically about there being a window that happens between like November and April that happens at the sunrise and the sunset where, you basically can traverse to these other worlds and all this stuff. And to me, I found that really kind of suspect, Henrik. You don't always try to look for a conspiracy under every rock, but when you have something like that where every single one of these sites nationwide, are all inaccessible at these times, it does raise some red flags.
Yeah, it does, and it should. Now, there seems to be, the case seems to be that most of these mounds and other structures actually have been built by giants. If you look at the incredible amount of these earthworks, of how much material you'd had to shovel, and if we zoom out a little bit then, Josh, and talk about the bigger picture, a possible scenario of what happened, where these giants come from or came from. I know that there's multiple different theories out there. One could even be that actually it's the mounds are placed on natural earth or energy node points where we've heard story about seeds, for example, being supercharged, if you will, on these quote-unquote sacred sites, because there's something to the energy there. The question is, maybe the people who actually live there managed to grow bigger because of it. We don't know. They could come from somewhere else. But what I like about what you've done in the film is that you've tied it into the ancient stories about giants. And I mean, it's obviously a reference to the Genesis 6 giants, the Nephilim. They even had these double row of teeth. They had, in some cases, 6 fingers or toes. It is those stories. That's what we're talking about here.
Well, what I found was interesting was this, Henrik, and I detail this towards the end of the film, is that I would go back and study. I mean, I had to become really an expert in so many fields that I had never studied before in working on this. Everything from geology to ancient, near and far and Far East, Middle Eastern studies. I mean, I had to get into all kinds of history and things that I had never really delved into before, and I think that was actually a good thing, because it gave me sort of fresh eyes looking at it. I didn't have any preconceived notions about the information before going into it. And what I found was interesting is that you had this massive just migration of these Canaanite Amorite people that ran out of the Middle East after the fall of after the takeover of Babylon and the exodus of the Jews and all of this stuff. And you started to see between the periods of 800 AD and about 1100 AD, you started to see, specifically in the West, specifically in the Americas, but right in that time, which perfectly coincides with this mass migration of people from the Middle East around that area that was once called the Amorite territory that extended through the entire area that we now know as Palestine and all of Mesopotamia, really, Iraq, all that stuff. And that around that time was when you started to see there was something going on between those years where you started to have mounds and ceremonial sites popping up all over the United States that never popped up here before, even though you had centuries of indigenous populations and indigenous tribes existing in the United States long before. So why did these mounds and why did these sites start to pop up overnight? The reason you started to see these pop up overnight is because you started to see a massive influx of peoples that were coming from other areas of the world that were coming and essentially wanting to find a new place. And I think that this time periods, they seem to have existed for a few hundred years, and then there seems to be an event that is coincidentally described in many Native American traditions where there was some sort of an extermination, where these guys, these giants came from faraway lands. They were here. Some of them seemed to be benevolent, seemed to want to help the indigenous populations, give them knowledge, set them up with religion, teach them how to plant. And then you had other ones that seemed to be, very overbearing and in some cases cannibals. And so there seems to be an extermination. And that is what is fascinating about the mound sites, is this idea that you had these people who at one point were appreciated, but then later they seem to become a threat to the indigenous populations. And one of the things that that really, really struck me about going out and visiting a place like Moundville, Alabama, as you mentioned, the sheer amount of people and work that it would take to build these sites. It just doesn't make sense that it was built by regular small people. I mean, the story at Moundville is that they spent 300 years building these mound structures. Jeez. And then as soon as these were done being built, all of the people in that area completely disappeared. And when you look at the stories that talk about these alignments being aligned with these portals of souls, and because when they first found Moundville, Alabama, they thought it was a death cult. I mean, they called it the Southern Death Cult for a long period of time. But the thing about it is they weren't particularly finding mass amounts of mass sacrificial rituals or anything like that. It didn't make any sense that they were calling it the Southern Death Cult when they weren't finding mass amounts of rituals. What they were finding in these mounds, they were finding giant skeletons, and they were finding strange anomalous artifacts that had symbols on them that were pertaining to Syrian symbology found in Oklahoma. You had all this Phoenician iconography found in Oklahoma. I actually talked to a gentleman a couple of years ago. I was up in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and this is before I started this film project, and I was up there with the band I used to play in, and the Tahlequah, Oklahoma, by the way, is the seat of the Cherokee Nation. And this gentleman was telling me about how, a long time ago, this is what the Cherokee believe, Phoenicians came up to Oklahoma through waterways in boats and seeded our tribe with a written language. That's why the Cherokee, the only tribe with a written language. And they gave us all this knowledge and this, that, and the other. And I had never heard this. And when I started researching for the film and working on all this and looking at the mass amounts of Phoenician-style buildings and artifacts that have been found in Oklahoma and Texas and all over the United States, that's when I started to realize that, okay, let's go back and see, were there giants that were said to exist in this area? of what was Phoenicia and Canaan and all of this. And, of course, all of those people that inhabited those lands, yes, were said indeed to be giants. So that's when it became pretty clear to me, Henrik, that these people, whoever they were, these giants that came from that area, were here in the United States, and they seem to have set up the tribal structure of the Native Americans in the exact same way that the lost tribes of Israel were set up. And that was just a highly, highly interesting revelation.
And they're kind of where it dovetails a little bit with some of the Mormon theology and all that as well. But the story of Beowulf that we have up here in the north is basically a carbon copy of many of the North American stories as well, of these red-haired giants. Basically, I mean, in the Beowulf story, Grendel, who is the big giant, is killed by Beowulf that comes from an area where we're headquartered in south to midwestern Sweden right now, and it's just so interesting that you have this connection with these rune scripts also found in America, in many parts of the world. Ohio, there is the Kensington rune stone. It just goes on and on and on, and the connections are just, they're far and wide. And I mean, what else than diffusionism could explain this, Josh? What do you think?
Well, absolutely, and to give people an idea of what you're talking about when you mean that, I haven't seen the film yet. The two predominant schools of thought when it comes to these issues is you have diffusionism and you have isolationism. And isolationism is the track that of course mainstream science and other institutions such as the Smithsonian have taken, and that idea states that cultures had no outside contact with each other whatsoever. And I mean, they even take it to the extreme to when you actually have proof of it. They still say it's not possible. But diffusionism supports the idea that cultures throughout the world had contact with each other, and that at various stages through time, there have been people all over the world from different areas going to different parts of the world and seeding indigenous populations with knowledge of religion, science, astrology, farming, all of this stuff, as almost an altruistic thing. But that you also start to see the roots of religion, and how, even if these giants were not, let's say, let's say for a minute that they aren't Nephilim, or they aren't, Anunnaki, or whatever people want to say they are.
Yeah.
Regardless of all that, if you were a giant and you had knowledge and information that indigenous populations who didn't have that information had, I mean, you would be seen as a god. You would be revered as a god. If you showed up and you're a giant and you start teaching these people and showing them how to properly grow crops, you start teaching them about religion, about invocation, about how to use nature and the earth in your advantage and work in tandem with it and set everything up around that. Yeah, sure, these people are going to see you as a god all day long. And I think that to me, Henrik, is the most important thing to focus in on, regardless of what you believe their origins is or whatever it may be. The most important thing is that it's not a surprise, and it's not a shock, and it's not out of the realms of believability that anyone with a giant stature and a great deal of information is going to have a potential to set themselves up as a great and powerful being. That's all there is to it.
Oh, definitely. And if we simplify for a moment, there seems to be quote-unquote good, quote-unquote bad giants as well, actually. And you have an idea about this. I really like that one. I want to talk more about that. Two different races of giants. They look somewhat similar, but there's differences between them. And there seems to have been some kind of schism here. Explain this a little bit? Well,
that was another shocking revelation for me. It was also something that was causing a lot of confusion, because I would find, as you said, I would find these reports. The report of some of these seem to be these dark-headed giants with double rows of teeth that are very, in some cases, cannibalistic. I know in the Rockwall Success reports, they said they found some sort of big pot full of cooked human bones.
Yep.
There's all these reports from the Native American tribes about the savage black hairs, and then they talk also about a race of red hairs that came across. And then another thing that blew me away that I found out, which I didn't know because I really never paid much attention to the whole Mormon thing really at all, didn't really study it, But once I started finding out that, their entire basis of their thing and their religion is based on this idea that there was these two tribes, one of black-haired giants and one of red hairs, and a battle in the order for another one to wipe the other one out, it just became very, very startling to me. And the idea that these golden plates of the Mormons were found in these mounds, and it just really gave me the idea that, okay, there's something to this, but what they're telling us that there is to it is, I don't think, the real truth. There's more to it than what the Mormon religion says there is. There's more to it, but that's the whole thing is, if it's Mormonism or it's Christianity or it's the Freemasons, when you really study it and you get down to it, all these guys are the same thing anyway. I mean, they're all come from the same origins, from the same roots that go back to the Babylonian mystery schools, the Brotherhood of the Snake. They come from the same tribes out of Israel. I mean, Brigham Young, Joseph Smith, they were all of the Levite bloodline that went back to ancient Israel. But the idea of there being two separate races of giants really struck me from the reports of them being found in mounds. And what you seem to find the most predominant ones are the red-headed giants. But there's also these dark-headed giants as well. And the natives have stories of a great war that happened. And essentially what they claim is that these dark-head giants actually existed and were actually here in the United States, what we know as the United States, before the red man arrived. And that when they arrived here across the alleged Bering Strait land bridge, they found already inhabiting this area these cannibalistic giants. So they had to, who knows, how many of them got wiped out, but essentially they had to hide themselves. This very well could be where these, as we were talking about earlier, the usage of these underground tunnel systems around the rock wall, this very well could be where that came from. Yep. And then they also tell about a benevolent red-haired race who came from the east. Specifically, they said they came from the east, and they did not want to harm the indigenous people. And in fact, for all intents and purposes, for what you see in the film, the DNA evidence supports the idea that there was a lot of commingling going on, a lot of breeding happening here between these giants and the smaller indigenous populations. And this is how the indigenous people got all of their tribal rituals, all of their religious ceremonies, and at some point they just had enough and banded with these red-haired giants and wiped out this race they called the Ronagwetawonka, which is what the indigenous populations refer to as these black, dark-headed giants. And then it seems that at some point as well, the red-haired giants, who were initially seen as help, were eventually seen as taking over too much land. They were usurping too much land from the natives, and they were eventually wiped out by the native populations as well. There's many stories of the Lovelock Caves in Nevada where they had cornered some of these, the natives had cornered some of these red-haired giants, and they basically lit a fire and smoked them out. And later, many years later, people went in and found these remains in there. But it really does seem that there was an extermination of these giants because they were seen as a threat, but at the same time, they seemed to have a knowledge that was very important at giving the indigenous populations of the United States some sort of culture. And this is why when you started to have the colonization effect happen in the United States and people started coming across the West, initially with Manifest Destiny, you had this declaring of all Native Americans as being savages, as having nothing worth preserving, and there being a separate race. This was the scientifically held, established belief that there was a separate race of mound builders who built these mounds, who built all these earthworks, who were very sophisticated, who seeded the Native American Indians, gave them culture, gave them knowledge, and then once they got Manifest Destiny, they came and they claimed all the land, and then everybody started kind of saying, oh, okay, well, now we feel bad. Well, we wiped all of them out, but there's still some left, so we want to give them their reservations, and we want to make this not look as bad. So what they did was they switched that around and said, okay, we were wrong. the Native Americans actually do have stuff worth preserving. They actually weren't savages. And by the way, they built all of these mounds and all of these earthworks. And if you say otherwise, you're a racist.
Yeah.
I mean, they completely changed this thing because at that point, they had all the land anyway, so it didn't matter.
Yeah. It's incredible. We have no idea about the complexity of history and the consequent rewritings. When I think back to this time, the ancient Earth and what really, the conditions was like here, I get a very eerie feeling when you really start setting your mind into it. It's fascinating, of course, and it's exciting, but it's also something. There seems to be something dark there because there's these different wars that have been going on between different types of humans, or even if we are talking about some kind of alien race or mankind planted here or whatever it is, it's just fascinating. We're going to take a break here now between the segments, Josh, but before we do that, I just want to, of course, bring up some of the details here. The film we're talking about is called The Lost Secrets of Ancient America, and this is the first volume, and you can let us know, Josh, if you know even at this point how many volumes you have in store here. But if you find this interesting, you should, of course, pick up a copy of the Blu-ray or the DVD, and tell us where to go and where to do this, Josh.
Okay, great. And you can go to my website, theglobalreality.com. You can also just type Josh Reeves into a search engine, and mine will be the first website that comes up there, theglobalreality.com. Right now we have digital downloads. You can get it in two different qualities. You can get it in a standard HD, about a 4.7 gig file. It's a 3-hour and 34-minute movie, so it's chock full of info. You can also get it in a higher quality Blu-ray quality for $25 there at my website. I'm actually gonna do a special here exclusively for Red Ice Radio listeners. The first 20 people that hear this broadcast and go and get themselves a digital download at my website are not only going to get the digital download, they're also going to get a DVD sent to them free of charge. So that's something I want to do special for the great listeners of Red Ice Radio, because the people that support your work, Henrik, and help you stay alive and keep going out there also inadvertently help my work as well. And it's a great thing. But we're also going to have probably by the time people hear this, we'll have the discs up there for sale as well. And as far as how many volumes up there's going to be, as many as it takes. I mean, this is really just the opening salvo. Sure. And I'm hoping to have some various archaeological digs on the rock wall and other sites, and to also document that in the film. So this really is just the intro. And man, I'm just fired up about this show, and I can't wait to get into more with you.
Definitely, there's some great material in this movie, this film. I hope you get it if you want to hear more, because it's really worth it. And this expose of the stories of the giants from these ancient papers, but we're going back to 18 and 1900s and such. It's just so valuable. It's excellent stuff. So again, the globalreality.com is the website, and we'll have that linked up, of course, on redicecreations.com. We'll carry on with Josh in the next segment, so stay with us, everybody. We'll be right back. Josh Reeves is with us from theglobalreality.com, and we're talking about his latest, The Lost Secrets of Ancient America, the first volume. Thank you for staying with us, joining us here in the members area, as we're going to continue now with more. And we are just scraping the surface. They're just, there's so many tentacles and so many tangents hinging on the story. Again, we're talking about the background of mankind itself, prehistory, the ancient world, what really was happening on this planet at that point, and it has to do with everything that is going on today. And there might be some people, Josh, that ask themselves now, then, all right, well, if this is a reality, why don't we know about this? Why is it not more talked about? There is an extensive cover-up going on here, primarily from the Smithsonian, actually, and they've been really instrumental in getting their people out on the scene early on in some of these archaeological digs and saying it's this or that or the other. But the question always is, what do they really know? What are they covering up, and why are they so afraid of this story getting out there, Josh? Let's try to get into this a little bit.
Well, that's a fantastic question, and it's one that was very heavy on my mind throughout the course of making this first volume of this film and doing all this research. And it's one that does indeed have its answer in a lot of things we've been talking about already, that we talked about in the first hour. And at the core of it, Henrik, I think, in my opinion, based on the evidence and based on the research, I think that it has to do more than anything with the fact that it throws the entire timeline of history, both from a scientific point of view and also from a religious point of view, as far as creationists and this idea that the Earth is only 7,000 years old and all that. It really, all of this stuff, from the rock wall to any of these other ancient sites, this idea that, Christopher Columbus discovered America and nobody else was here before that.
I mean, come on. Can we let that go now? I mean, even on the, and you showed this in the film, of course, as well, but even the Scandinavians were here before that, for Christ's sake. That's more or less established now, come on.
Sure, and that's another thing, too, is that we have to also understand, Henrik, is that whether we're talking about, and this is a revelation to me, whether we're talking about Celts or whether we're talking about Scandinavians or whether we're talking about, Middle Eastern or Phoenicians, what we find more and more is that all of these things were all essentially the same people. They spread out throughout the world through diffusionism, and they had different names in the different areas that they inhabited in at different points in time. Yeah. And again, as far as why they want all this covered up, the main thing about it is that it completely throws. Well, if you look at it from this idea of man was, created in the garden and this happened on this such and such time ago, and then you look at the archaeological evidence and you start seeing dating that runs in excess of 200,000 years. I mean, we have voluminous amounts of artifacts that were found in soil stratas that date to 200,000 years. You have dating done at the rock wall that shows that a catastrophic event happened there sometime between. Actually, it was uncovered. The wall itself was uncovered, not covered by anything, somewhere between 20,000 and 200,000 years ago. And this is conclusive based on the soil analysis that's been done on the overburden and the covering of it. And the data proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that a catastrophic event 12,000 years ago covered up this wall. So that's the thing you start to see, is that the reason why they are so scared of any of this coming out is because if you start to unravel, it's like a string, or you start to pull it a little bit, you pull a little bit more, and the whole thing falls apart. And I think that's what they're scared of, is because at the root of this, you have years and years and years of scientific data, years and years and years of history, religion, everything else turned upside down on its head, and the perception that creates in the mind of the individual who sees this information is, well, if that's true, then how can I believe any of this stuff that we've been told? And that's really the root of it. You really start to see that you really can't believe anything that we've been told about our history. It all seems like a watered down, convoluted version of itself. And what I found is a lot of this has to do, when you study the ancient texts, they talk about these people who were, they were giants. They talk about the giants being excised from the Middle East and from that area by the Hebrews, by the Jews, and how they essentially were deemed to have any record of their existence wiped off the face of the earth, and any memory of them basically thrown away and forgotten about. This is what was ordered when they destroyed King Og and a lot of the giants in the ancient Middle East. And then you had, of course, the exodus of the Jews and all that stuff. Mm. And so it seems to me that these artifacts that are found in the United States pertain specifically to these people that were essentially deemed to be stricken from the record, stricken from the history books, and forgotten about for religious reasons. And I think that's where a lot of this comes from, is that these guys... specifically the Freemasons, like we talked about earlier. The Freemasons are a relatively new group historically.
Oh, sure.
They've only, they haven't really been around, but the information and the knowledge that they have has been around since time immemorial.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things specifically that they are afraid of, is they don't want people to find out their origins of this. I mean, these secret societies really, they've all just taken on different names and different characteristics through the years, because if you're a young person, you're coming up and you want to join a group or a fraternity or something like that, there's this natural thing about being young, Henrik, where, you don't want to have anything to do with what the fuddy-duddy old people had to do with before you. You don't want to go join, for the most part, the same group that your father joined. So that's what they do. They change the names of these things, but the essence of them all goes back to this ancient knowledge that has to do with mathematics, building, sacred architecture, all of it. And that's one of the things that the Masons learn about in the craft, is they are able to see a structure, see a building, see anything, and glean information from that based on the mathematics, the building, everything that is encoded into that structure. And this is why the gentleman who initially looked at the rock wall immediately said this was not a natural structure, because they could see the mathematics and they could see the codes built into that rock wall that you see existing today in modern structures or ancient Gothic cathedrals throughout Europe and the rest of it.
Yeah, indeed. I recall a conversation with Christopher Knight about also the origins of some of the traditions for building, and he brought up the Norse connection. And again, it what way did it go, so to speak? Was it an origin place from the Middle East somewhere that spread up in Europe? Was it the other way around? All the details can be argued. We have sites up in Sweden like the Kiviksgraven, which is a burial site where you have these Omega signs and Phoenician scripture.
Really?
Yeah, basically stuff like that. And I mean, so it could be argued where comes from what. I've found so many connections between northern Italy and Sweden in terms of rock carvings. They look pretty much identical. There is one tradition that talks about Norsemen actually going down and taking over the amber production down in northern Italy for a while, and hence also actually brought some of the construction knowledge and stuff like that. I mean, so again, back and forth, that can be argued, but nonetheless, there have been communication between these groups. There have been sharing of knowledge, and then into this mix, as you brought in now, Josh, is this idea that there was also another race of giants that at least partially some of them seems to have been, well, hunted around the earth, I would say then. I mean, I don't know else what to call it. If they came over to North America and, regular mankind, so if you so will, got there a little bit late, and there seems to be a period where the evidence hasn't been covered up in the same way as it has been on other continents. Hence, we have so many stories of these giants in America. Is that how you think things unfolded, or do you have another take on that, Josh?
Well, I mean, here's what I've gathered from looking at the research myself, and I was quite confused about this in the beginning myself. It seems that there was, and you know this, you've probably read about this as well. There seems to be a remnant that was left over after the supposed fall of Atlantis. There seems to be a remnant of both humans and of the Atlanteans that survived the deluge and survived the catastrophe. Yeah. And some of these seem to be essentially just the reason they seem to be savagistic and they seem to be, just these brutes is because everything they had, all their knowledge, everything was wiped out. And so when you had successive generations that survived and then would be born, essentially those next generations that would be born in places where maybe there used to be Atlantean strongholds, which would be all through North America. Later on, when you had new generations born after the waters receded, they had nothing left. They had no knowledge. They had no books, nothing to give them any kind of a culture. So they gradually seem to have become a savage people. And it seems that there is definitely a connection. At least it describes this in the text, between these pre-flood Atlantean groups that existed in these cities throughout the world, and a connection to the people who later, after the floodwaters receded, came up on dry land in places like what we now know as Iraq and Babylon, Mesopotamia, and started to do what we described earlier all over again, and that was to seed the populations with knowledge and information. And it seems that it's just a big circle, Henrik. I mean, when you look at this, it started in one place, it went to another, there was a catastrophe, and then the whole thing cycled again. Yeah. And towards the end of the film, I show some maps and various things on the screen that give you an idea of how these migrations took place. And they took place almost exactly as you talked about earlier. You had a genesis point of these people that came out of the Middle East. They spread throughout Europe, throughout Asia, throughout Africa, and then eventually started heading west and going to Western lands. We're talking 5, 6, 7,000 years ago. I mean, there's massive evidence of ancient copper mining going on in Michigan, where they pulled out hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of copper for years and years and years. That copper's been analyzed and has been found in artifacts from everywhere in the United States, in mound sites, to places in the Middle East, in Israel, in Iraq, everywhere. This copper was all over the place, and that's what is said in the ancient text, that these giants ran out of the Middle East and that they fled back to their copper mines in the West. I mean, the ancient Mesopotamian texts state that explicitly. So that's what you see, is, Henrik, is these people, after a slow diffusion in every area that they inhabited, intermingled and interbred with the indigenous populations. And it seems that this is how you started to have the rise of various different types of races and cultures and people. And it seems that not in every case, these giants wouldn't produce giant offspring, but their giant DNA, which seems to be dormant in a lot of us, does seem to come out in the modern day in some species and some cultures of people. There's several pictures in my film of some Arab guys that are standing there with a regular guy, and these guys are like 9 feet tall. You've got the couple that lived in Ohio that were giants. They lived in the 1800s, early 1900s. So you start to see that the DNA evidence completely supports, and I've got clips in the film of that, this idea that this diffusionism was going on, but not only were they diffusing their culture and their knowledge, but also they were changing the bloodlines and setting up these indigenous populations. The one of the startling things for me, and one of the biggest revelations of all of this work for the film, was the DNA evidence pertaining to the Hopewell Mound Builders and the Cherokee. And the Cherokee believe up and down the wall that they have Jewish ancestry. And it's really a misnomer that they have Jewish ancestry, because they have a Semitic ancestry. And that's what people forget, is you can have people who are Jewish or Arabic or Islamic, Muslim, but you're all a Sephardic people.
Same DNA.
Same DNA. And a lot of this DNA, they found, specifically there's a clip in the film where they trace all of this Cherokee and Hopewell Mound Builder DNA back to one specific place, and that is the hills of Galilee. And if you look at the hills where the hills of Galilee are located, I have a map in the film that shows it, that was considered Amorite territory, the giant territory, during that time. So it's fascinating. People who thought they had Indian descent or thought they had Jewish descent all seem to have this European ancestry that also goes back to, it's like a European ancestry, but it also goes back to areas in the Middle East. It's completely confusing to people because we tend to think of things in the geopolitical strata that we know of them in the modern day.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So that's one of the things that's confusing about it. But the DNA evidence shows beyond any shadow of a doubt that this specific type of DNA, King Tutankhamun had this DNA as well, was started in that area and did diffuse throughout the world. But because the people who it originated with were wiped out, there's one story in particular in the film I have that was taken from an Ohio newspaper, I think in the late 1800s, and they actually interviewed this Indian man about this massive graveyard of giant skeletons they found in Ohio. And when they asked him about that, he said, "Oh, we don't go near there. That was here long before the Red Man was here." And when they went and dug all this up, they just found it was a graveyard of red-headed giants. So that's the other thing that you start to see is a lot of these earthworks and a lot of these things that have been associated with Native Americans. The Native Americans throw their hands up and say, "We didn't do that.
We didn't do it. Yeah,
that was here before us."
And how often doesn't that take place? I'm thinking about the Incas and there's so many others. I mean, just look at some of the structures in South America, the way they've been built up on hillsides and up the mountains, way up there, and just thinking of dragging stones up there with the tools accessible.
Oh, there's no way
at the time. Even if they had big machines like we have today, I mean, you can't do it. It's impossible. Something else did this.
that's absolutely the case, and that's one of the things that, again, with the rock wall, that I started trying to collate between various different sites, like all the ones in South America, like Machu Picchu and
Sure.
Sacsayhuaman, and all these different sites where you have all these stones that appear to be. A lot of these stones seem to be. Some of them seem to be cut stones, and some of them don't. Some of them seem to be just jointed stones that were fit together. But the interesting thing about the rock wall stones is that they are absolutely a cast stone. These were made of materials that were brought together and then cast to make the individual stones of the wall. And that's another interesting thing I want to point out about the rock wall to people, is that it has a mean elevation of 550 feet above sea level, meaning this entire 20-mile in diameter structure was leveled by someone at 550 feet, meaning that the structure itself does not change as the terrain of the land changes. Once you get down to the bottom of where it is, it's mean at 550 feet above sea level. And if I could, I wanted to give people some of the information on what's contained in these stones, Henrik.
Sure.
You have 55% zircon, 17% garnet, 13% tourmaline, 2% rutile, 2% starlight, 10% titanite, and 1% brookite. And then there's also several others that have been found. It's all in the film. But the interesting thing about it is that these are all rare earth metals. They never exist, specifically brookite and titanite. That's the key thing. You never find titanite and brookite together naturally in nature. And the reason you don't is because titanite and brookite together make titanium. And when you want to make titanium, you have to go to an area over here and get titanite. You have to go over here and get brookite. You mix them together, then you make titanium. In the rock wall, they are found together in the rock wall stones. And this is the most interesting thing about it. Their molecular structure, normally when you would take these types of minerals and you would mix them in a soup, their molecular structures would always, in every case, bond together and basically create one individual set of bonding structures. In this, you don't have that case. They are somehow, by some technology we're not aware of, these stones makeup and material, each one of these aforementioned minerals that I talked about here are separately in the stones. Their molecular structure has not bonded together with the other. They have somehow remained independent in the stone structure. And what's interesting is that they are held together with what they call a geopolymer material that is made out of 3 different types of crystals that are brought together. And when you expose this stuff to air, when John Lindsay was pulling out these stones from the wall, when you would expose them to the air, you could actually see after about a couple of days where the crystal starts to grow as it's exposed to air. It's absolutely waterproof. It's absolutely indestructible. It has a hardness almost on the scale of a diamond. A diamond is 10. The rock wall is an 8. And that is because of these heavy minerals. So my thing about it was, I said, well, okay, here's the minerals. Here's what we have it's made up of. These are not normally found in this part of the world naturally ever. So, where would someone find these materials? Where would you go to find all of this stuff? So I started looking and searching for that. And lo and behold, I came across this mention of a place called Beringer Hill, which is about a couple hours south of Dallas, where I live, near Austin, Texas, about an hour from Austin. And was just completely blown away. I'd never heard of this spot. You had Westinghouse and Edison there back when they found out, trying to get their paws on it. Of course, they're famous for stealing Tesla's technologies and selling them to J.P. Morgan. And it's very interesting that this Sumerian king list that I mentioned at the end of the film as well was also in the possession of J.P. Morgan for a period of time. So those two things really made me say, okay, when I start to see the big bankers interested in this stuff, combined with the Freemasons and everything else, it can't be an accident. And so I sent out to find out, okay, is this where the material for the rock wall was quarried at? And come to find out, at this area they call the Llano Uplift in south central Texas, it has every single material that is made up in the rock wall stones found there in abundance, as well as thousands of other rare earth minerals and metals that have never been found anywhere else on the planet, some of which are radioactive. And then later found out that they found a similar 20-mile in diameter structure only about 100 miles from here, where they had furnaces and an altar room with altars on it that were found. That's another thing I want to try to investigate more in the future. But I was just, people will see all this detail in the film, so I'm only giving you really the short of it here. But the fact of the matter is, I now have the pretty substantial, solid evidence of where the quarry for the rock wall stones is found, where that area came from. The biggest thing about the rock wall that was one of the anomalies with these rocks and stones was the piezoelectrical makeup of the wall, and also the strange high-level electromagnetic field signature. Now, this is not the same as, you pick up a magnet and the other end attracts another magnet, and that's all good, or it attracts iron filings. None of the rock wall stones actually do that. But if you put a magnetic Gauss meter on the rock wall, it measures somewhere around 40 Gauss, which when you look at Earth as prime magnetizer, Earth generally has a Gauss reading about 0.5. So for this thing to have this massive amounts of electromagnetic field to it was really startling. And some of the stones that I brought back from that area where I thought the quarry is low, where I think the quarry is located, I have I don't have any sophisticated equipment yet to do all this. So I actually have a Gauss meter on my iPad. So I took the iPad, because it has a magnet in it, and it's able to get some rudimentary readings. And some of the stones that I was analyzing from that area of the Llano Uplift were giving me a 40 to 50 Gauss magnetic field, but they wouldn't give me that on any other rocks or stones or anything I put it up against. So I don't want to say conclusively that the stones from this area that I analyzed have the same magnetic Gauss reading as the rock wall, but over the further analysis, I think we'll be able to determine that. But just the fact that it's showing in that target range with just a rudimentary check is very interesting.
Indeed. Well, this seems to be a common property on a lot of these stones. Either, if they're put together, as you say as well, geopolymer. That's very interesting. Sounds a little bit like the theories about the reconstituted limestone that people like Joseph Davidowitz talks about, on specifically when it comes to the stones of the Great Pyramid, that they're in some way molded together to have a specific property. But okay, well, that's interesting. So there's no real quarry in that sense that they've taken the stones to build the rock wall with. It's put together. What about the knowledge of DNA and the chromosomes? You have a section about this in the film that's very interesting, and it goes a little bit more into the actual symbolism, a lot of things that you've discovered on these sites as well. Talk a little bit about that, Josh.
Well, that was the whole genesis for a lot of this stuff. I didn't set out in making this film to try and prove this thing to be something I wanted it to be. I strictly was trying to come at this from the example of, from the standpoint of being somebody who was new to this. So one of the sites that I visited, one of the mound sites I visited was a place called Spiro Mounds in Oklahoma, and it's the only open Native American park to the public in the state of Oklahoma, even though there are many. And this site I really wanted to visit because I was reading about the stories of all these strange artifacts they had. They found a tablet with Syrian writing on it near this site. They found a conch shell with it's the damnedest thing. It just really blew my mind. It still blows my mind thinking about it. This thousands of year old artifact with a serpent in the shape of a swastika, with a Maltese cross in the middle of it. I mean, this was just, it just really, I was like, wow. And then come to find out, they said also they found near Spiro there a red-headed giant buried in a mound with armor and a sword and all this stuff. And I said, okay, that's too much. I've got to go check this place out. So I went out to go check this place out, and it's in the middle of just nowhere, Oklahoma. And it took us forever to find it. Once we finally got there, it was about an hour before close. I went out, started getting footage. Guy didn't like the questions I was asking, because I was asking, why can't we see any of these artifacts that were excavated from here? There's a great book called Looting of the Spiral Mounds. People should check out for more information on that. And I was just perplexed at all of these sites, from Moundville to Spiral Mounds. You go there, and you can go read, anywhere online or anywhere the official records about the archaeological discoveries that were found in these sites. Hundreds of thousands. They found hundreds of thousands of artifacts at all these sites, but yet when you go to any of them, you can't see any of the actual artifacts that were found there. You can only see replicas. In fact, to see any of these artifacts taken from Spiral Mounds or any of these other places, especially Spyro, you have to go to the Louvre in Paris. You have to go to the top museums in England. You have to go all over the world to even catch a glimpse of this. But if you go to the actual place where they came from, there's nothing but fakes there. So they didn't like the fact that I was asking about that, and they were getting uncomfortable about it. And then this is all in the film. I saw this other spot that to me looked more like where it was located at. So after that, we're like, okay, well, let's go check out these thing called the Heavener Runestone. It was like 40 miles away from this Spiral Mound site. And also another interesting thing, probably only about another 50 miles away from here, I would say, is where you have Tahlequah, Oklahoma, which is the seat of the Cherokee Nation. And again, those are the people that believe they were seated by Phoenicians. So only a hop, skip, and a jump from there is where you have this red-headed giant skeleton being found. That's where you have this artifact with the serpent swastika Maltese cross. And you have this thing called the Heavener Runestone. And this was really, really, I've been my whole life living in Texas. Oklahoma's not far, so I have friends and family and all that stuff up there, and I've been going there my whole life. But wow, I thought I had been everywhere across Oklahoma, and we started trying to go to this Heavener Runestone Park, and it was just way out in the middle of nowhere. We finally find this thing, and I just thought it was odd that you had to go, drive up this mountain, which you see in the film, and then once you get to the park where these runestones are at, you have to descend down this long walkway 100 feet down. So somebody on this massive stone carved these strange glyphs that, in my mind, and in my opinion, don't really appear to be, some of them do, some of them don't. The ones on the giant stone, to me, appear to be symbols more than they appear to be actual text and script and writing. But you have to ascend way up and then way down. And why did somebody put this here if it doesn't mean anything? And the common belief of what this Heavener Runestone says is they say that it says Gnome Doll or Glome Doll, which they say means something about the mountain or the place. So I'm in this, and I'd already done all this scaling up and scaling down, and I get down in there, and I'm filming this, and I look at this, and just this thing pops into my head and tells me to look at this differently, and so I start looking at it differently. And I had remembered reading that Dal, D-A-L, was Sanskrit for split, to split. Mm-hmm. And so I went, well, gnome could very well mean genome. You think about how our DNA and chromosomes are, you've got 3 billion. The human genome is basically made up of 3 billion bases of DNA split into 24 chromosomes. And that's when I started going, wow, is this trying to say something about, genetic engineering, of something about splitting the genome? That's exactly what our DNA is made of. And then I go right next to it into the other little room. And the next thing I see in the other little room are these things they call the Podio runestones, which are some smaller runestones that were found in a direct line with the larger Heavener runestone. And you had 5 of these runestones that were found running in a direction of south to west, or northeast, I believe. Maybe it was northeast. I can't remember. It's all in the film. But essentially they were found in a direct line. And when you go and look at these smaller runestones, they have one that says Medoc on it, which is very close to Marduk from the Sumerian lore. And then you have another one that says, for the magic and protection of Alu. Alu was the bull in ancient Mesopotamian texts, so was Marduk. He was also known as the bull. You have this magic and protection thing being thrown around. Marduk was also said to be the god of magic. And so that's, as you mentioned, that's when I started looking at this going, well, wait a second here. Whenever this stuff was discovered, whether it be by the Smithsonian, whether it be by individual researchers, it's always cross-referenced with what is known and what is known up to that point to be indigenous to that area or that particular country, and that's it. Never in any case, because, of course, the Smithsonian believes in this hard-line isolationist idea. Because of that, none of the Smithsonian scientists, or anybody else pretty much for that matter, had ever thought or even considered to start cross-referencing these artifacts found in the United States with the names of things found in ancient Mesopotamian texts. And as soon as you start doing that, you start to see all sorts of correlations that cannot be a coincidence.
No, it's like you can't do that because we know that didn't happen. So therefore, we have to exclude that that conclusion, right? That's what they think, but yet with the evidence presented in front of their eyes, that look, this is the same as this. Why is that? There has to be a connection, right? No, it's just even if it's just on level of coincidence, it must be some kind of divinely act then or something like that. I mean, there is correlation. Come on, people.
Yeah, and again, if it wasn't for the fact that you had all these other artifacts found in the same area, that also, I mean, the tablet found maybe 40 miles from these runestones that was in an ancient Iberian Libyan text. You have a stele found in Iowa that has the predominant language that was used, the three predominant languages that were used during the time of Solomon, and that are found on a stele in Iowa. You have these places like what is it? It's in New Hampshire. They call it like America's Stonehenge. It's actually, I talk about it in the film a little bit as well. Even on their official sign, they say that this appears to be of a Phoenician origin. You've got other sites found around the United States that have Phoenician writings on them. You have these ancient triangular tablets that I describe in the film that were found in Dallas that had Phoenician letterings and skull and bones on them that were found at a depth in which they were pulling dinosaur bones out. I mean, it's just unbelievable, and you can't believe it's a coincidence when all of these roads to all of these artifacts, the Back Creek stone as well that I talk about that has the inscription for Judea or Gudea, then you find out Gudea was this the great ruler of that particular era of ancient Mesopotamia that the Amorites existed in, and how the Amorites were considered to be disciples of Gudea. And then we find this Back Creek stone, the Smithsonian actually found it in a Cherokee burial mound in Alabama under the head of a red-haired giant. And even though they found it, they tried to come back and say, oh, it's just a fake.
Yeah.
Well, if it's a fake, then why is it still kept under lock and key in a museum? You would think a fake would be, thrown out to the garbage and discarded. But no, it's still kept under lock and key. It's in a college in Tennessee right now. But there's so much of it, and I didn't even scratch the surface in this film. I'm hoping that in the future volumes, I'll be able to go explore some more of the sites around the United States, get more evidence of this, and present it in more films. But it's just fascinating. And as you said earlier, this idea that what we've been told on the surface of our history and who we are is in any way, shape, or form the fact, it just starts to fall apart more and more every day as you look at the evidence.
There's just so many of these out-of-place artifacts, OOP-arts, and
right.
It just goes on and on and on. I wonder how much we don't know, how much has been suppressed so far. But it seems to be, we have people like Barry Fell, has looked into
right.
this. You bring up the very interesting, and let's talk about that a little bit, Burroughs Cave in Illinois.
Absolutely. Burroughs Cave in Illinois is a very interesting one because this is another one of those sites where the scientific community has said, this is fake. This is absolutely fake. There's no way this is real. And when you look at the artifacts that were found there, it starts to be pretty clear why they would say this is a fake because for all intents and purposes, the things that were found at the Burroughs Cave in Illinois seem to be they just prove everything we've been talking about right here. I mean, you see evidence of, they've got, Sumerian type things depicted on artifacts there. They've got ancient Iberian and Libyan and Mesopotamian inscriptions there. I mean, it goes on. And apparently, from what I understand, the reason why you have so many of these sites that have been deemed fake is because when the Smithsonian, oftentimes what happens is people will find a discovery, or they'll discover something, and they're just, Henrik, regular, everyday, for the most part, mainline people, that believe everything is just okay on the surface, so they don't know any better. They find these things and they go, well,
I better hand it over to the Smithsonian because they'll do a proper investigation of this thing. Nope.
Right. Yeah. It's just, it's that well-meaning, people mean well, but they just don't know the real reality of it. And so what happens is the Smithsonian comes along, they say, thank you very much. They take it, they put it under lock and key, and it's never seen again. But in a few odd cases, and Burroughs Cave is definitely one of them, there are several others out there that have been found. In every case when they can't get their hands on the evidence and the people won't give it up to them, they automatically, with just a broad scope brush, just say, well, that's a fake artifact, all that's fake. And then these people can't go and get any recognition or money for what they find or anything else, because the almighty Smithsonian's declaration has been that this is a fake, and who is going to challenge this Smithsonian? They're the know-all. And that's essentially the same modus operandi that they applied to Burroughs Cave and other sites that they applied to the rock wall. You would think that that something established in 1927, especially with the evidence and the way technology has progressed and the data that we have now and have attained since 1927, you would think that they would at least allow a new investigation, or at least a new examination of the new evidence, but they won't. They're happy with that 1927 standing because it fits right in to what their current standpoint is, and they don't want people to get outside of that plantation of thought.
I know that you want to do as well, Josh, is to try to bring more and more focus and attention to some kind of more honest investigation being done on the rock wall, and certainly there's many other sites and places as well that this could be done on. But, I mean, you mentioned a couple of people in the 90s, most recently, like Lindsay and some others that have been looking into this, but there really hasn't been that much in excavation. We don't even, it's difficult to get access to the rock wall. As you said before, most of it is still underground. Maybe there has been extensive study, but if so, this hasn't been let out to the public anyway.
Well, that's been my whole problem with all of this, and that's why I'm hoping to conduct an archaeological dig of my own at some point with the help of others out there. Is because I know of sites right now. I mean, I know places right now that land is for sale where there's parts of the rock wall at. But the thing about it is, we have all this information, and as I said before, I've cataloged almost all of it. I'm pretty sure all of it in the film pertaining to the rock wall. But for some reason, Henrik, none of this stuff has been cataloged or documented properly. Meaning, when the dozer started shaking from the piezoelectrical properties of the wall, like it was going to take off, how come somebody didn't have video of that?
Yeah. How
come there wasn't video of that? When you had this analysis done, how come we didn't see the documentation shown on screen? I want to have a new investigation of the wall. I want to have a new archaeological dig, and I want to take all of this data and basically get it documented, high def video, high def pictures, and get this stuff collated and put together so that the public can see it for the first time and understand that it's not just what somebody is not just saying this is actually the facts. And so there's so much more that we don't know yet, and I think could come out, especially now. I mean, the only map we have of this thing was done by John Lindsay by hand over the course of like 2 or 3 years, sneaking on to people's property and, just taking a stick and sticking it under the ground. I mean, we have things like LiDAR, ground penetrating radar, all of this stuff now, which, of course, NASA and the powers that be have access to that we don't have access to, which we could for not a lot of money. That's the whole thing. And so that's my goal, is I want to do the first real conclusive and honest documentation of the investigation into the wall. I want to document the whole step from the first breaking ground. Nobody's actually even gone all the way down to the bottom yet, all the way down to the foundation, 7 stories down. The stones get bigger the farther you go down. Nobody's done that yet. I mean, to me, whether or not you want to say this is a natural formation or whether or not you want to believe, like the evidence says, that this is not a natural formation, regardless of that, there has not been enough investigation and enough collating of the data up to this point to justify either belief, in my opinion.
Yeah. I know so many sites around the world that are neglected. They don't have any, there might be a minor interest, from certain people, but of course they can't get the funding. There's very, very selected. This is happening in Sweden all the time as well. The major finds that have been done in the country is basically by people who have, farmed their land and basically stumbled over the, gold chains and necklaces and, pottery and stuff like that in a region which is highly neglected, which is the western part of Sweden, pretty much. But at the same time, all the funding for the archaeological stuff goes on up around Stockholm, because they say this is, where the cradle of Sweden is. So it's happening all over the world in the same regard. I also, when you're talking about some of this, Josh, I can't help to think and feel that it's connected with sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, and just this idea that this is a worldwide culture, share the knowledge basically of both how to construct these things and maybe even the reasons why to do them for purposes of catastrophe and stuff like that. But let's go back to the Maltese cross again and talk about the potential link there in that symbol and everything, because I remember watching Syrian or Assyrian symbols. There are symbols in I think it's in Tiwanaku.
Tiwanaku,
that have on some of these pillars, they have these exact Maltese cross and everything. There seems to be a succession here which goes back to ancient times. So that when we look at the symbol today and associated with the Knights Templar or the Knights of Malta, what have you, it goes way, way, way back there.
Oh, it goes way back, and you actually see depictions of this in ancient Sumerian arts as well. You'll see the Maltese cross there. The one thing that stuck out to me the most, Henrik, about this was I almost subtitled this film On the Trail of the Feathered Serpent, because everywhere that I went and all the spots that I visited, there was always it's just the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl. That whole thing kept coming up time and time again, and I detail a lot of that in the film as well for people to see. But then I found out that when Quetzalcoatl first came on the scene, however long back, at thousands of years ago, however it was, he came out wearing this Maltese cross. And then, of course, as you mentioned, you go further up in history and you see it later being used by the Red Shield, Rothschild. I mean, you can go on and on and on, the Templars, on into history. But I think that to me is the greatest indicator of this ancient knowledge that originated in the first secret society, the Brotherhood of the Snake, and then stretched itself out through all these other successive mystery schools, mystery religions, and everything else. And I think that's why that symbol has been on, the swastika serpent symbol, which the swastika goes back to the Phoenicians as well. You see it again, Quetzalcoatl, the Templars. It seems to be not to mention, Knights of Malta and the whole Vatican thing, but it seems to be this divine knowledge, this divine information at its core seems to have religious overtones to it. And this seems to be what various different religions around the world have been based on. So whether we're talking about an established religion like Christianity or Catholicism, or whether we're talking about a group like the Brotherhood of the Snake or the Templars or anything else, it really represents this divine knowledge. It really represents this ancient knowledge that of astronomy, of mathematics, of building, of culture, possibly even genetics and other high-level scientific things. And it seems to represent this idea that the small amount of people have this information, and that symbol is depicted and carried by people who seem to have or have had access to this knowledge. I mean, here's another strange, startling thing, Henrik. I mean, if you go and look at Roslin Chapel in Scotland, there is a type of maize or corn depicted in Roslin Chapel that wasn't known outside of America until years and years later that was depicted there. So how did that get there? I mean, there's all sorts of stories of, the Templars having boats and going to North America and places like that thousands of years ago. I mean, you start to see that none of this is separate. We are taught that all of this stuff is separate individual points, and the more that you research it and the farther back you go, the more that you see that the separation is an illusion. The separation is a lie. This is all the doings of a massive worldwide people who all in the beginning had their genesis in one place and one origin.
And do you think, George, that this that there is a cult today? Maybe there's just a small group of people within some of these fraternities or brotherhoods, what have you, that actually have pretty much the full picture at this stage. They know what has happened. They, for whatever reason, then keep it hidden and actually manipulate and control. Consequently, they steer the world, I would say, to a certain degree, in terms of, well, because if you hold back people from knowing where they come from, what the true origins are, there's a tremendous amount of power in that. You can set up a whole educational system that is built on lies. The psychological damage is huge on in that regard. But the question is, if it's been preserved to a certain extent, the knowledge, and they have pieces of this picture. Do you think that's the case today?
I think it is. I mean, to me, I think it's hard to nail it down to one particular group, because I think all the groups have pieces of this or are operating from the same viewpoint on it. I mean, just as we talked about earlier, the Native American religious traditions that were carried along and depicted in these mound sites, the alignments to these star systems that depict the travel and that the soul takes after death, that mirror Egyptian, Tibetan, Book of the Dead. I mean, you start to see that, and you start, okay, well, these guys, even though they were separate and on separate parts of the world, they're playing from the same book. And I think it's the same way whether you want to talk about Freemasons or Rosicrucians or whatever group it may be. And I think certainly the groups in the modern day that have this knowledge that you're talking about here, Henrik, I think probably we don't know their names, and
right.
We probably won't even ever hear about them because, as I said, they start new groups throughout history, but they all seem to be operating from this same standpoint, and it's all about perpetuating this system indefinitely. I mean, it's all about perpetuating this this overarching control system and keeping itself perpetuated indefinitely. And the only thing that will keep this thing from perpetuating itself indefinitely is the real truth. And when people realize that we have so much unlocked potential in ourselves, we hear about, ancient messianic figures having all these, powers and abilities, and we don't realize that really it's an allegory for something that we all have inside of us, that the system is designed 100% to keep suppressed in us, so we never learn how to use that muscle, we never learn how to use that energy, and when we don't become a threat to them.
Well, that's right. I mean, this would blow the lid off the whole thing. And again, I think a large portion of the control system is actually structured around, as one of the points I tried to make earlier, that if you're not allowed to know the origins of both yourself, but also what you're part of, then that you're going to be a more controlled, target in that regard. And something like this would open up the floodgates. It would. I mean, can you imagine the people who would start asking questions about this? Where do we really come from? What has happened on this planet before, and why haven't we been allowed to know it? I mean, it's the information has been out there for a long time, but it's still in such a small degree, and you really have to go search for it on the web. And then there's counter information to that, trying to discredit some of these people are doing true investigation. And again, just the further back in the record you go, and some of those early researchers seem to have a whole lot of room to operate in and stuff like that. They could actually do some interesting stuff, and people like Barry Fell and some of these others I mentioned before had done some amazing connections, between the Celtic groups and how they came over to America. You had the Viking stuff for the Kensington runestone and stuff like that. So it is there, but it's difficult to get it out to the masses because of the structure of the media and everything else. But I still believe that through continued, investigation and raising awareness on these things, it will slowly catch on, because I think, the origin of what this is all about is one of the most important questions that there is, Josh.
And I think that to me, Henrik, I mean, I think that's the most important thing about my new film is the fact that, if nothing else, it is a great example and a great collection of all of these various anomalies that a lot of people may not even be aware exists. I mean, I was blown away by a lot of this stuff. I was blown away to find out that, you have mounds that were found in Syria and mounds that were found in Saudi Arabia, and these look identical to mounds that were found in Alabama.
Yeah.
That kind of thing is stuff like that, and that's been so far the response I've gotten from people back on the film so far has been that is just the sheer amount of stuff that, is right under our noses. I mean, a lot of my listeners have gone out, and I encourage other people out there, when they hear about these sites, a lot of people, there's a couple of my listeners that lived near mounds their entire life. They never visited them. They never thought anything about it.
Yep, I know.
And they started hearing me talk about it, and as soon as they went out and started checking out these places, they started having, interesting experiences on their own, and you really get an idea, and that's why I really am looking forward to being able to go out into the field for further volumes of this film to gather more data, because it's something about getting out there and actually physically going to these sites and experiencing them for yourselves. I can't even explain it, Hendrik. It almost gives you a verification in an almost non-material way. It's almost like when you go there and you're investigating this. I had one of my listeners tell me that she went to the Cahokia Mounds, which are in southern Illinois near St. Louis. They actually have a mound there that's bigger in its footprint than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Most people don't even know this thing exists.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't even know it's there. And she went out there, and she just had this sort of voice talking to her the whole time saying, thank you for looking into this. Thank you for appreciating this, because there seems to have been profound spiritual events that happened at these various sites that have embedded their energy into those sites, as you mentioned earlier. And I think that does have everything to do with why these sites were initially built on spots where they were. And, getting to the long and the short of what I think the rock wall is, I mean, I absolutely think it was one of these pre-Diluvian cities that's described in the Sumerian king list, which is found in a museum in Oxford, England, that details this 432,000-year reign of these gods over these cities prior to the flood. And when you look at how the rock wall is it's almost right smack dab on the 33rd degree parallel, Dallas is. If you look at the fact that these first messianic deities like Quetzalcoatl, the first being Oannes, first showed up in ancient Iraq, ancient Babylon, right on the 33rd degree parallel after the floodwaters receded, it makes complete sense that, yes, they had their city set up on the 33rd degree parallel. The great deluge happened. It got wiped out. They went under the water for a period of time in these fish suits, as the texts talk about. And then once the waters receded, they came right back up in the exact location, right on the 33rd degree parallel again. And this is where you started to have the rise of what we now know as Sumeria, Babylon, Syria, and that whole area. It's a fascinating thing. And these people have left their mathematics in these sites all over the world. The Newark Earthworks in Ohio is another one that is chock full of, it has its own mathematical codex. 666 is encoded into this thing several times. You've got a depiction of this. Well, the Newark Earthworks specifically depict the symbolical traveling of the soul into these other star systems and whatnot after death. And then you go and read, what the Theosophists believe. Somebody like Alice Bailey, who wrote in her book, Initiation, Human and Solar, that when you're a Freemason and you reach the highest levels of Freemasonry on Earth and you die, you enter into the next lodge where you're only an adept, and that lodge is located on Sirius. And this is identical to the idea that the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians have put out, and the idea of the transmigration of souls, the idea of being able to take your soul energy out of one vessel and plant it into another vessel, and do that continually. And this is what you see described in ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian texts concerning people like Thoth and many others, Enki. And it's just this continuation. The Emerald Tablets of Thoth described that as well. And I did a reading of that on my radio show that people can find at my website. And that's the thing I find over and over again. The Rosicrucians as well believe that the soul is being crucified on the body. That's what the rose and the cross represents. But it all, in the end, has to do with this idea that you can transcend this death of this physical body and you can come back and inhabit another body again. And this is one of the deepest held and closely held secrets of the ancient society. So, as we mentioned, it doesn't matter what the groups are called now. It all goes back to that original idea that they want to keep this in secret because, again, as you said, if you can do that, you've got the power, and you've got the power over the people. You know,
there are many things that aren't recognized as being ancient sites or mounds as well, but you can actually see it after a while. You can train and see it. I've been going around in the last couple of years in different places around in Western Sweden primarily, and there are tons of sites, hundreds of raised stones and mounds and these burial shafts or whatever it's called in English. And we have one mound that's closed that have standing stones on top of it. And they're all around you. Yeah, they're all around up there. And I think that it's the same around the world. This is something we never heard, hardly hear about in school when we're young. We didn't anyway. It's a neglect of the cultural heritage, or at least it's a, they're not recognizing it and don't giving you the facts of what the area is where you're born in. But, when you visit the sites, you if they are recognized, usually there's plaques there that allegedly tell you everything about the sites, right? But I'd say go and check out the site first and get a sense of it and feel it before you are programmed with what it's supposed to be by these, government-sponsored plaques that's on there. And I just want to mention one website as well that people can go to check out. It's actually the Megalithic Portal, and they have links to, I think it's primarily in the UK and England, of course, but it's in Europe, it's around the rest of the world as well. And I think people can even submit there. So if you go out and find stuff, you can actually submit it there to this database. It's megalithic.co.uk, the Megalithic Portal. So I urge everyone to check that out and see what's close in your area. And if it's not on there, report it so we can know about it.
Well, I think that's very important. And what I found startling is that when you had the beginnings of colonial America and you had people coming east to west, settling, people often have wondered why is it that they chose the spot where they built New York City at or Dallas at? Why didn't they build it 50 miles up the road? Why didn't they build it 100 miles up the road? It's because when they started coming across, they found existing cities, mounds, in all of these cities. I mean, Philadelphia had a ton of mounds that were covered. I mean, there were literally hundreds of thousands, upwards of, I think I've heard, 900,000 earthworks and mounds found in the United States alone in the early days, and most of which have been bulldozed and destroyed and built on top of, with a scant few left that have been made parks out of. And as we talked about earlier, I think the only reason that they saved some of these sites is because there is something there that they want to use for their own purposes and their own devices. But there's no question that we haven't even scratched the surface. Another one of the goals of this film, besides being able to have archaeological digs and stuff, is to, as you mentioned, to get that awareness up. Because, when I first started finding out about the mounds, I started to see them everywhere I went, in places I've been going my whole life.
I know.
And never even noticed it when it's right there under your nose. And that's another one of the key things about all this is hiding it in plain sight.
That's right. You see the shape of it, and usually, at least in Sweden, I don't know how it is in Texas, but there's a large set of older oaks or something like that growing out of it, and you see the shape of it. It has to be something right here. And
I'll tell you where that's prevalent at a lot, Henrik, in the United States, is Georgia and Virginia. That's where you see that type of thing a lot.
Yeah, see, and there's something going on there. And again, as you said, Josh, it doesn't mean automatically that it's a grave site. I mean, again, we have sites in Sweden where it says this is a burial site, it's believed, but we've never dug in there, so we don't know anything, but it's believed to be a burial site. It could be anything impossible, that's in there.
Be a giant in there.
It has something to do with probably the properties of the land, though. It's a node point in the Earth energy field or something like that, and they've probably done it to magnify or symbolically make a visual representation of that thing, and then there was probably all kinds of stuff that was used for ritual purposes, council sites. There's all kinds of ideas there, but it's really cool.
Here's another interesting thing, Henrik, that I found out too. A lot of the mound sites initially that were found in the United States, a lot of the famous founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
He had mounds all on his plantation that he excavated. George Washington had a lot on his as well. And that wasn't just with founding fathers and stuff. You started to find that where these rich white aristocrats in the colonial days were setting up their giant plantations, they would always set them up on these spots that had these mounds and whatnot on them. And I think that had probably, as you said, has everything to do with the frequency of this. And the area in Rockwall where you have, and this is no joke, you can look at the map, the Rockwall actually has the Pythagorean theorem built into the structure of it. And the area in Rockwall where the Pythagorean theorem is built into the wall, that area of houses over there, Henrik, I can't even get get footage of because it's all gated communities because those houses over there run in excess of $20 to $50 million.
Yeah.
The richest houses in Rockwall are built on these structures. And I've talked to listeners of mine who have described having family members who live in that area and going to the house for vacation and an overwhelming calm, overwhelming just feeling, very good and feeling so good when you're there. And there has to be, as you mentioned, this energy vortex. I think, as I mentioned earlier, with the missing time, the UFO sightings, the energy force, I think that has everything to do with this strong electromagnetic signature that is left behind residually in this crystal and stone in the wall, and that this also is what is giving this soothing, calming feeling, because crystals can do that. I mean, if you take crystals and you take big ones and you build yourself a house and you build them into the foundations of your house, you will have a calm, positive vibe and feeling in your house because of the energy that these stones and these crystals put out themselves. And I think that the builders knew this, and probably the stonemasons and whatnot that constructed these expensive properties knew that as well.
Interesting that we talked with Richard Holden a little bit. He talked about some of the houses that was in and around the Chichen Itza area there in the Yucatan, and he talked about also there allegedly being data for them they lived longer, those who are inside of the perimeter of where this field affects people basically, and those on the outside actually only lived half as long. And as well, I want to mention you mentioned Thomas Jefferson, his Monticello, the plantation house, whatever it's called. Check out some of Kurt Lindahl's work. He has done some great stuff on that, how it relates to other sites and stuff like that. So it's there's definitely something to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kurt's a great researcher. He actually contacted me after the last time I was on here with you, Henrik. And he definitely has a lot of stuff that ties in with all of this that I hope we'll get to eventually to tie all this together. But as I stated before, I mean, nobody else has made a film on this Rockwall thing up to this point except me. I felt this I don't know, just almost like a calling, like it was something I was meant to do this. And so this is by no means, this first film, even though it's 3 hours and 34 minutes, it's by no means the definitive investigation. It's by no means a closed book. And I'm hoping that this will, inspire other people who are interested in this to want to come forward and help out the cause and help out our ability in getting a lot of this accomplished. Because, I mean, the evidence shows beyond any shadow of a doubt that it definitely brings up more questions than answers. And I think that's the one thing that should always drive you when you start to see, when you dig this deep into something, as I digged in with this film. And in the end of it, after making a 3 hour and 34 minute film, you have more questions than answers.
Oh, sure.
That's a pretty good sign.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's great. We're going to round things up here in a little bit. I want to thank you for your work, Josh, and urge you to keep it up, of course. And I want to urge everyone out there listening to get a copy of Josh's film and support him so that he can continue doing the work that he's doing and proceed in, second, third, and so on volumes of this, because it's really interesting stuff. And if you're interested in this stuff, what we've been talking about, do get a hold of a copy. Please, again, Josh, give us the website. And if there's anything else, by the way, you want to mention before we wrap things up here for this time.
Okay, it's theglobalreality.com. That's theglobalreality.com. You can also go to Google and just type Josh Reeves, and my website will be the first one that comes up. People can go there and they can get digital downloads. They can also buy the discs. We'll have that up pretty soon as well. Hopefully by the time people hear this. You can also go to my website and make a donation if you want. I want to be clear. I'm just a regular guy, and everything I do comes from donations from people out there who are like me and you and want to change this stuff and know that the Smithsonian and the powers that be are not going to do this for us, and we have to do this ourselves. And I couldn't be here and couldn't have done all this without all the great people out there who donated and supported my work. Henrik is just a big supporter of my work and has helped me out a great deal. This guy doesn't just talk the talk, folks. He walks the walk, and he really tries to help out fellow researchers and people like me, and I just commend him so much for it. And, anything that people can do to help this out, whether they want to help finance a dig or whether they just want to help finance the next film, any of that goes towards this cause. And I believe wholeheartedly that once people see this film for themselves, they're definitely going to have an interest in this, like you and I, Henrik. And I'm just totally excited about what the future holds and can't wait to be back up here to talk to you again, my friend.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for that, Josh. Website again, theglobalreality.com. It's very exciting stuff, and I do hope you keep it up, Josh. We'll talk more soon.
Okay, thank you so much.